Hey guys, Chubs here, back again with another ACS scripting tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about multi-dimensional arrays. Before I really get into this tutorial though, I do want to stress that it's important that you understand what an array is before watching this video. So if you haven't yet watched my previous videos in this series that cover arrays and parallel arrays, I highly recommend going back and watching those. Otherwise you're probably going to be pretty lost and you're not really going to be able to follow along. So what is a multidimensional array? How does it differ from just a one-dimensional array that I've already shown in my previous videos? Well, as you should already know, a one-dimensional array basically allows you to have a bunch of variables under just a single name, and then you can just pull out one of those variables by plugging an index number into the array. A multidimensional array, on the other hand, allows you to store several arrays under a single name. And so you aren't dealing with just a bunch of variables under one name, you're dealing with a bunch of arrays under one name, and that's the major difference. The type of multidimensional array that we're going to be going over in this video is a 2D array, an array with 2 dimensions. Now you can of course go beyond that. You can have a 3D array, a 4D array, and beyond. But 2D arrays tend to be the most common type of multidimensional array. Now when most people explain 2D arrays, they tend to discuss them in terms of rows and columns, but the analogy that I'm going to use for this video is going to be a little bit different. Instead, I'm going to be discussing them in terms of filing cabinets. So let's go back to the one-dimensional array that you should already be familiar with. Think of those as just a plain old filing cabinet, just a single filing cabinet. Just like a filing cabinet, when you give that array a size, you're basically determining like how many drawers that filing cabinet has. Let's say that we create an integer array and we say that it has a size of 5. That's sort of like creating a filing cabinet that has 5 drawers. Now let's go over to a 2-dimensional array. Instead of thinking of it as just one filing cabinet, now just think of it as having several filing cabinets, like in a single room. Whereas a one-dimensional array has just a single pair of brackets, a 2-dimensional array has 2 pairs of brackets. In the first pair of brackets, you're going to be entering a number that basically determines how many filing cabinets there are. And in the second pair of brackets, you're going to be entering a number that determines how many drawers each filing cabinet has. So hopefully this visual will really help you understand the difference between a 1D array and a 2D array, and will also help you understand how 2D arrays work. But we're not going to stop right there, because I also want to produce an example for you guys right here inside of Doom, just to show you a quick little test of 2D arrays in action. So before we really get to that, I guess I'll go ahead and just show you this quick little example map that I've set up here. So we have a bit of a hellish-like outdoor area with a player start, and here in the middle we have a backpack and some armor, and then off to the sides we have a chain gun and then a super shotgun and some ammo. And then ahead we have this sort of, you can almost see this like a flame, it's like a transparent flame wall. I've put the block player property on this so the player can't pass through, but monsters can. And then behind this wall you can see a almost like demonic looking teleporter. And what we're going to set up basically by the end of this tutorial is just a very simple wave based system where monsters will spawn here and come out towards the player in waves. So we're basically going to have 3 separate waves. So what will happen is we'll have a few monsters spawn, and then a short delay, and then a few more monsters, and we'll do that to make up 3 waves that the player has to fend off. And of course we'll be doing that using 2-dimensional arrays. But before we start throwing that logic together, let me just produce a simple example here for you guys for 2D arrays to show you how they're typed out in code and how you can use them. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the script editor, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. And at the top, as always, we'll just go ahead and type that line that we always throw up here. So the number sign, include, and then inside quotations, zcommon.acs. And then we'll go down, and we're just going to throw together just a quick little test. So let's create a 2-dimensional array of strings. So let's go back to that filing cabinet example that I gave you a second ago. Let's say that we want to have 2 filing cabinets, and both of those filing cabinets should have 3 drawers. Let's go ahead and make that happen here in code. So this is going to be a string array. So I'll type str or string as the type, space. And what this 2D array is going to consist of is basically the titles of some first-person shooters that have come out. So for the name of this multi-dimensional array, I'll just call it game titles. And here's where it's a little different because, as I said a little bit earlier, whereas a one-dimensional array, which is the array that I've featured in my previous videos, has just a single pair of brackets, a two-dimensional array has 2 pairs of brackets. So we'll, instead of 1 pair of brackets like that, we'll type another pair. You have to have 2 pairs for a two-dimensional array. Now let's go back to the filing cabinet analogy again, and I'm going to keep going back to this throughout this tutorial. So remember I said that we want to have 2 filing cabinets, and both of those cabinets should have 3 drawers. Well, for the first pair of brackets, we'll type 2, and this is basically like how many cabinets we want, or if you want to talk in programming terms, this is how many arrays we want this multidimensional array to contain. And for the second bracket, you can think of that as how many drawers each filing cabinet should have. So I'll type 3. And if you want to talk in programming terms, this basically is how many elements each array is going to have. So instead of filing cabinet terms, I'll just talk in terms of like programming terms. This means that we're making a 2D array that's going to contain 2 arrays, and both of those arrays will contain 3 elements. So going back to the filing cabinet analogy, we're going to set this up so that we have 2 filing cabinets, and both filing cabinets have 3 drawers. Okay, so how exactly do we initialize this array now and fill it with some strings? Well, this is also where it's a little bit tricky, so let me show you how this is done. So after both of the brackets, we'll do space and then equals, just like when you're initializing a 1D array. But here's where you got to watch out. So we'll first type a pair of braces, again just like a one-dimensional array, and we also want to have a semicolon at the end. And with a 1D array, you would just have this single pair of braces, and you would do like your elements. Like if you were doing an integer array, you would have your integers separated by commas just like that. This is a 2D array though, so what we have is a collection of arrays. So what we need to do inside of this pair of braces is include several pairs of braces. To be more specific, since we've said that we're going to have 2 arrays or 2 filing cabinets inside here, we need to put 2 pairs of braces inside the pair of braces we already have. So one way to make this much more readable and understandable is to make use of spacing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to intentionally press enter, and I'm going to move this closing brace down there at the bottom just like this. I'm going to place it right under the opening brace so that we have something like this. And then I'm going to go up here and just tab over a little bit and create another pair of braces. So remember, I just said that this is going to contain 2 arrays, or you can think of it as 2 filing cabinets. Well, this pair of braces that I just put in between here, you can think of this as the first array or the first filing cabinet. So I'm actually going to just move this over here a little bit. Here we go. So think of this as the first filing cabinet. And again, each filing cabinet or each array is going to have 3 drawers or 3 elements. So let's go ahead and fill this up. So this is going to be a collection of string arrays, and again it's going to be titles of some games, some first-person shooters. So we'll start to fill this up with some strings. So let's type 3 names of some first-person shooters. I'm just going to go with some old 90s first-person shooters. So we'll just type Doom, comma, and then Hexen, comma, and then I'll just type Duke 3D instead of Duke Nukem 3D just to save a little bit of space. Okay. And then after this first pair, or this little extra pair of braces that I threw in here for the first array, we're going to do a comma, and then we're going to come down and we're going to throw in another pair of braces. And so now we're working on the second array. You can think of this as the second filing cabinet. And just like the one above it, it's going to have 3 elements. It's important that you stay consistent, otherwise you're going to run into errors. So here I'm going to type 3 more names of some games, and for these I'm going to do some more modern games. So I'll just type, I'll just go with some like early to mid 2000s shooters. So I'll type Far Cry, Doom 3, Half-Life 2. And we are finished in terms of initializing this array. We have an extra blank line here, so I'm just going to get rid of that so everything's a little bit more close up together. So we've created a 2-dimensional string array. We've named it game titles. We've specified that this 2-dimensional array is going to contain 2 arrays, and that both of those arrays is going to have 3 elements. Or if we want to use the filing cabinet analogy, we've specified that this is going to be 2 filing cabinets, and both of those cabinets will have 3 drawers. So now let's look at the initialization. We've specified that the first array will contain the following 3 strings: Doom, Hexen, Duke 3D. And we've said that the second array will contain Far Cry, Doom 3, Half-Life 2. Or if we want to go back to the filing cabinet analogy again, we've said that the first filing cabinet's drawers will contain Doom, Hexen, and Duke 3D, and the second filing cabinet's drawers will contain Far Cry, Doom 3, and Half-Life 2. So I hope that makes sense to you. So now that we've created and initialized this array, let's actually try and grab something from it. So we'll do that with a very simple enter script, which will run when the player enters the map. I'll just call this script array test. And again, this will be an enter script, and that way we don't have to trigger it with a line or anything. So let's say that we want to grab something from the second filing cabinet, which would be this filing cabinet right here. Let's say that we want to grab the second element of the second filing cabinet. Well, this is the second filing cabinet, and the second element of that filing cabinet, or the second drawer of that filing cabinet, is the string Doom 3. How would we do that in code? Well, it really goes back to the fact that 2D arrays contain 2 pairs of brackets. That means you now have to use both of those brackets inside of code. So to display that second element, we'll use the print function. So I'll go ahead and just type print, and then since this is going to be a string, I'll type S for the type and then colon, and here's where we enter what string we want to display, and we're going to have to make use of this 2D array. So I'll type the name of the array, game titles, and here's where we have to make use of both brackets. So we'll go ahead and type the first pair of brackets, and here's where you put in the index of which array or which filing cabinet you want to access. And just like with 1D arrays, array indexing starts at 0. So an index of 0 is actually going to be the very first element. So if we want to get the second filing cabinet, we need to plug in an index of 1 here. Now, again, this is a 2D array, so we need to throw in another pair of brackets after that. And this is going to be like the filing cabinet drawer, or the element of that array that we want to grab. Remember, we said that we wanted to grab the second element. Well, again, since array indexing starts at 0, the second index is actually going to be 1, or the second element is actually going to have an index of 1. And then we'll finish this off with a semicolon, and I'll make sure that this compiles. There we go, we got no errors. So when the player enters the map, the array test script is going to run, and then this is going to use print to print whatever is in the second filing cabinet's second drawer. And we're doing that thanks to this code here. So this is going to get the second array, or the second filing cabinet, and this is going to get us whatever is in the second drawer of that filing cabinet, or whatever the second element of the second array is. So let's go ahead and run a quick test, and let's see if Doom 3 does indeed print on the screen. Okay, so that was a success. You could see Doom 3 printed on the screen. So I hope that lengthy explanation and that small little example there really helped you understand what 2D arrays are all about and how you set them up and how you access their contents in code. So now that I've got that little example out of the way, let's get back to the map that I've set up here, and let's talk more about the wave system. So we're going to be using a two-dimensional array to basically create 3 waves of monsters, and I want it so that each wave contains 4 monsters. So let's go ahead and let's start making that happen in code. Actually, before I jump to the code, let me also just let you guys know that ahead of time I placed a map spot here on the teleporter, and I've also given it a tag of 1. I meant to show you that earlier when I was doing the little map tour. But now let's get to the code. So I'll go ahead and pull up the script editor. We'll zoom in. I'm just going to get rid of everything I've done here except for this line at the top because we obviously still need that. So let's go ahead and just nuke everything else. And so since we're going to be dealing with waves and we're going to be spawning monsters, what we really want to have is a collection of arrays that contain monster spawn numbers, and that way we can specify which monsters we want to spawn in each wave. So let's go ahead and just get started with this. So we're going to have a 2D array. It's going to be an integer array because a spawn number is an integer, and the name of this multidimensional array or 2D array will be we'll just call it wave monsters. So now we'll go right back to the filing cabinet analogy. We'll do 3 waves with 4 monsters each. So you can think of this as us wanting to have 3 filing cabinets, and each of those filing cabinets should have 4 drawers. So now we'll go ahead and initialize this, and you should hopefully be familiar with this now since I already showed an example earlier. So we'll do equals. We'll go ahead and throw the first pair of braces, and I'll also put a semicolon at the end because it's easy to forget that. I'll move the closing brace down just like I did before and sort of tab it over so it's under the opening brace. And then we'll start to populate our first array. This is going to be like the first wave of enemies that we want to spawn. And I'm intentionally going to make these waves easy just so it doesn't take me forever to test the map and kill the monsters, because I don't want you guys to have to sit there and watch me defeat monsters that are really tough. So we'll try and keep this nice and easy. So let's say that we want the first wave to just have like a couple zombie men and a couple imps. We need to start entering some monster spawn numbers here. And again, we're going to have 3 arrays, so we're going to need 3 of these pairs of braces, and each of these is going to have 4 spawn numbers. So I'm going to close the script editor window. We'll come back to it here in just a second, and I'm going to tab over to the ZDoom Wiki. And there is a very, very handy spawn numbers page. I believe I've already showed this several times in previous videos. But this shows you like the names of the monsters and also what their corresponding spawn numbers are. Now there's something very important here that I'm going to point out because we're going to be leveraging this in this tutorial. You can just use the plain old numbers. Like if we wanted to spawn an imp, we could totally just plug in 5 for the spawn number because you can see that's what it is. But also pay close attention to these identifiers here. If you read this description, there's a very important part here near the end. So let's read these last 2 sentences. This is a list of available spawn numbers along with the thing's identifier. You can also use the identifier name instead of the spawn number if you are running thing spawn from a script. So in other words, we can use 5 to spawn an imp, but what we can also do, even if we're using integers, is we can type t_imp. And you might wonder, how exactly does that work? Because t_imp, that's not a number. But basically, behind the scenes, the computer knows when we type t_imp that that's going to be 5. This is something that's basically built into ZDoom. It's just there for ease of use. But you can always type these specific identifiers, and you have to type them exactly as they're shown, and behind the scenes they will be substituted for their numbers. So I'll go ahead and shut up, and we'll get right back to the map and start to put in the waves. So let's get back to our 2-dimensional array that we were initializing because we're still in the middle of that. So we've got the first array here in our collection of arrays, and remember each one of those is going to have 4 monsters. And I think I said that I want this first wave to consist of 2 zombie men, or 2 former humans, and 2 imps. So for a zombie man, I think his identifier name is T_zombie. Yep, there it is. So behind the scenes, this is going to be replaced with whatever number actually corresponds to a zombie man or former human. So we'll go ahead and put that, comma, and then we'll just spawn an imp. So we'll do T_imp, and then we'll do another zombie man, T_zombie, and then we'll finish this off with an imp. And since we've said that each array will contain 4 elements, we're only allowed to put 4 of these in here. If we try and put more, we're going to get an error. So now that we've filled this array out, I'm going to go to the closing brace here and do a comma, and then we'll come down. So we finished basically the first wave. So now we'll throw in this second array. This will be like the second wave, or you can think of it as the second filing cabinet. And we need to fill this array up, or we need to populate this filing cabinet's drawers. So since this is the second wave, the second wave of 3 waves, I should say, I'm going to make this just a little bit tougher. So instead of just a plain old zombie man, we'll put in a shotgunner. So we'll type T_shot guy. I almost put shotgun. That would be the weapon. Shot guy, that's shotgunner guy or former sergeant. And then we'll go with another imp for this. And then after the imp, we'll just throw in a pinky, which is T_demon. And then the last monster in this wave will just be another imp, comma. And then we'll throw in the third and final array in our collection of arrays, or our third and final filing cabinet. And we want this to be the toughest. I'm not going to make it real tough because, again, I don't want you guys to have to watch me play forever to beat the waves. But we'll start this off with an imp, and then we'll throw in another shotgunner, and then we'll throw in a pinky, and then we're on the 4th and final one here, so we'll cap this final wave off with a, let's just say, a Hell Knight. And since this is the final array, we don't have to put a comma here. You just need a comma before the ones before the last. So we are finished, and we have another blank line here that we don't need, so I'm just going to get rid of this blank line, move everything up closer together. There we go. So let's do just a quick little recap here. We have made a 2-dimensional array. It is an integer 2-dimensional array. The name of it is Wave Monsters, and we've specified that we want this to basically contain 3 arrays, and that all 3 of those arrays will have exactly 4 elements, or 4 integers. We've specified that the first array should contain spawn numbers pertaining to the zombie man, imp, another zombie man, another imp, and then the second array will be shotgunner, imp, pinky, imp, and then the third and final array, or the third and final filing cabinet, will be an imp, a shotgunner, a pinky, and then a Hell Knight. So let me just compile, make sure I didn't make any typos. There we go, compiled without errors. So we have our 2D array, but on its own it's pretty useless. So let's go ahead and put this into action and make a little bit of a wave spawning system. So I'll go ahead and I'll just first write a basic initialization script. So I'll call this script just initialization, and I'll make this an inner script. And then something I always like to do is I just like to give the player his own ID ahead of time, just in case we have to use it. So I'm going to just type thing_change TID, which means change thing ID. And then 0 is going to be referring to the player here. And then for the player's new ID, I'll just say that it'll be 1337, like leet, just to be goofy. But we're doing this so that from this point on, if we ever need to refer to the player, we can use this, and we'll know that we'll be grabbing the player if we need to check him for any reason. Next, what we want to do is go ahead and kick off the wave spawning system, and I'm just going to do that through a separate script. We will call that script right here, but before we call it, let's just go down and write that script. So I'll go ahead and start a brand new script, and I'll just call this Wave Monster Spawn System, or let's just call this Wave Spawn System. That's a better name for a script. We don't want this to be an inner script. I actually just want to call this from here So I'll just make this void. And before we actually populate this script, now that we have it in place, I'm going to go ahead up here in our initialization script and just call this script. So let's do ACS underscore named execute, and then we'll type the exact name of that script, which is wave spawn system. And then for these other arguments, you can leave these all at 0. So for the map and arg1, arg2, etc., we can just leave those 0. So we'll just do zeros, and then at the very end we'll do a semicolon, and I'll go ahead and compile, make sure we don't have any problems. There we go, so we're good to go. So what's going to happen right now is when the map starts and the player enters, this initialization script kicks off. This gives the player an ID of 1337, and then this also goes ahead and executes our wave spawn system. And so now we know that this script is executing when the map starts due to our chain of events here. So we are ready to start spawning the monsters. So what we really want to do, if you think about it, is we want to run through all 3 of these arrays that we've set up. So how exactly would we iterate through these? Well, if you've seen my original arrays video, you should know that we were able to go through an array using a for loop. With a 2-dimensional array, however, you need to make use of what's called a nested for loop, and that's basically one for loop inside of another. So let's go ahead and put this logic in place, and then I'll spend time breaking down how exactly these for loops work. So let's type the first for loop. So we'll do for, and then I'm not going to spend a ton of time going over this because I've already covered this in my previous videos about loops and about arrays. But we'll just start this off with an integer I, and we'll make it start at 0. And then this loop is going to be iterating over the number of arrays. So we'll say while I is less than 3, because that's how many arrays we have in this 2D array, increment I. And we'll put a pair of braces there. So where my cursor is highlighted here, this is inside of that for loop, so we need to put another for loop in here. And if you're totally confused, don't worry, I'm going to come back here and explain this in detail how this works. So we'll create the second for loop here, and we'll type int, and we can't use I because technically we're still inside of this for loop, which means I has already been used. So we'll just move up a letter, we'll just use J. We'll start J at 0, and this inner for loop is supposed to be iterating not over the arrays but over the contents of the array. We've specified that each array is going to have 4 elements or 4 contents. So we're going to say while J is less than 4, and then we're going to say increment J. So let me just spend a little bit of time here breaking down how exactly nested for loops work. When you have one for loop inside of another, what happens is when the outer for loop runs and then you encounter this inner for loop, the inner loop has to run to completion before the outer loop ever iterates. So here you can see, just as an example, the outer for loop is starting at 0 and it's continuing until it's less than 3. So what's going to happen when it first kicks off is I is going to be 0, but then we hit this inner loop. And remember what I just said, it's a very important rule. When you have a nested for loop, the inner loop has got to run to completion. Since we hit this inner loop, it's got to go all the way. This inner loop starts J at 0 and it continues incrementing J until J is less than 4. So what J is going to do is it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3. And then we're finally going to kick out, and that's when we're going to come back up to the outer for loop, and I will increase to 1. When we go back down and hit this inner loop, it's got to run to completion again, so J is going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, and then we come up here and I iterates and becomes 2, etc. So now, taking that into consideration, this is effectively going to allow us to go all the way through these 2-dimensional arrays that we've set up. So let's try and spawn a monster from all of those arrays. Let's try and spawn each monster from those arrays. We'll start with the first monster and we'll run to the end, and then once we're finished, we'll go to the next array, and we will continue that until we have run through all three of the arrays. So to do that, inside of the inner loop, I'm going to say thing underscore spawn facing. And for the ID, that's referring to where the spawn point ID, to what the spawn point ID is. And as I showed you a little bit earlier, that's going to be this map spot, which has an ID of 1. So we'll type 1 for that. And this is the monster type, or the monster spawn number. And this is the really important part. So our array name for our 2D array is wave monsters. So we'll go ahead and type wave monsters. And here's where we have to type the 2 brackets. So the first set of brackets is whichever array or which filing cabinet we want to grab a monster from, and that is determined by this outer loop, because you can see it's running from 0 up to 2 because of this less than 3 condition. So this is going to allow us to hit this array, and this array. So what we'll say, since this outer loop is responsible for that, we'll plug I in to this set of brackets. And then when we throw in this second set of brackets, we're going to use J, because J is responsible for running through each element of the array that we're currently on, or each drawer of whichever filing cabinet we're dealing with. So I'll go ahead and plug in J, and then I'll do comma, and then for no fog, I'll type false, because we do want teleport fog to show up. And then for the new ID that we want to assign the monster that spawns, we'll just type 666, so that every new monster we spawn has that ID. And then we'll do a semicolon. And so now, to do a better job of explaining this logic here, we have 2 for loops. And as I said, there's an important rule when you have a nested for loop. The inner for loop must run to completion. So in this case, if you look at the outer for loop, we're setting I to 0, and then we're hitting this inner for loop. So that means I is going to stay at 0 until this for loop is finished. So let me use a comment here to sort of just give you guys a little bitty example here of how the code's going to work. So when we first run this, I is going to be 0. So I'll just put a 0 here above I. And when we hit the inner loop, this loop has got to finish before I can ever iterate and become 1. So what does that mean? That means while I remains 0, J is going to go 0, 1, 2, 3 because of this loop that we've set up. So we're going to start with 0, 0. That's going to be the first result we're going to have. And what would be a 0, 0? Well, that would be the first array and the first element, or it would basically be like the first drawer of the first filing cabinet. That would be our zombie man. So J would then increment, because again we're still in the inner loop. The inner loop's got to finish before the outer loop ever iterates. So what would 0, 1 be? That would be the imp. J increments. What's 0, 2? That's the zombie man. J increments again. We have 0, 3. What would 0, 3 be? That would be the last element in the array, the imp. Now when J increments, this is no longer true, because 4 is not less than 4. So we break out of this loop and we go back up to this outer loop. So what happens to I? Well, I was 0, but guess what? I just incremented. I is now 1. So we come back down and we hit the inner loop again. This is going to start all over. So I is going to remain 1 until this inner loop finishes. So what does the inner loop do? Well, we've already gone over this. It takes J and it makes it go 0, 1, 2, 3. So I is still 1. So we're going to go back to J, and again it goes 0, 1, 2, 3. So what would 1, 0 get us? Well, that would get us the second array, because array indexing starts at 0. So this is the second array, and 0 is the first element of that array. That would be the shotgunner. J is then going to increment. It's going to go from 0 to 1. What does 1, 1 get us? It gets us the second array and the second element. That's the imp. J increments again. It's 1, 2. That would get us the pinky. It increments again. That's 1, 3. That's going to get us the imp. And we're finished, because when J increments again and becomes 4, this is no longer true. We bounce out of this inner for loop, and then we go back up to the outer loop. So now I increments and becomes 2. So that sends us down to this last array. And then by now you should be familiar with it. We hit this inner loop. J goes 0, 1, 2, 3, which takes us through this array, and that gets us the monsters. So I hope that breakdown really helped make it much more clear what's happening. And if you're still confused, then I apologize. I really have done my best here to explain it. It's something that's not easy to explain, but I do hope I've made that clear. So now that we have this code in place, this alone is not going to be great because this code is going to run lightning fast. I mean, we're going to go through these for loops like in an instant. So we need to have some sort of delay. So let's throw in a delay here. This is basically going to be like the delay between each monster showing up. I'll just say, let's say there's maybe a 2-second delay. So I'll just do 35 times 2. That'll be approximately 2 seconds. Something else that I want to do that I nearly forgot about is when we spawn these monsters, I want to make it so that they quote unquote hate the player, and that way the moment they spawn they come after him. And the reason I'm going to do that is because if you don't, then what'll happen is if the player's like around the corner out of the monster's line of sight and it spawns, the monster's just going to awkwardly stand there like a statue. So we don't want that. We want it so that when the monsters spawn and appear, they're coming right after the player, even if the player's not in their line of sight. So to do that, I'm going to go up above the delay, but right after our spawn code, and I'm going to type thing_hate. And then the hater is what is doing the hating, and that will be the monster. Remember that when we spawn these monsters, we give them the ID of 666. So the monsters which have an ID of 666 will be the haters, and the hatee, that's the person that's being hated, that will be us. And because I assigned us an ID of 1337 above, we can use that. So that's the player's ID. And then for the type, I'm not going to go over all these. You can check this out on the wiki. There are a bunch of different types that you can use for thing hate. I'm just going to use 0. That's just like the basic default type, and that'll get the job done for this situation. You can go check those out on the wiki if you want to learn more. And then I'll put a semicolon at the end. So what we're saying with this line of code is when the monsters spawn in and they have an ID of 666, we're saying take that monster, make it hate the player. So it's just that simple, and that'll make them come right after us. Now there's one last little thing I want to do. Right now what we have is we're making a monster spawn and hate the player, and then we're waiting a couple seconds, and then we're spawning the next monster. And that's all fine and good, but what I also want to do is just throw in a little bit of an extended delay between the waves. Not between the monsters, but between the waves. How would we do that? Well, this kind of goes back to the nested for loops that we're working with right now. This inner for loop, think of this inner for loop as being the filing cabinet drawers. We're going through each drawer with this inner loop. The outer loop is what goes from filing cabinet to filing cabinet. So if I come down here, this is the outer loop. So what we can say here is once we've gone through all of the filing cabinet drawers with this code, we can throw in a delay that's a little bit longer. So we'll do like delay, I'll say like a 5-second delay. And so to go over this logic again in terms of the nested for loops, what we're basically saying here is the outer for loop is going through each filing cabinet, and then the inner for loop is going through the filing cabinet drawers. So we're saying here that as we go through the filing cabinet's drawers, we're waiting a couple seconds each time we pull something out of the drawer. Once we're finished with all of the filing cabinet's drawers, we're going to wait 5 seconds before we move to the next filing cabinet. And then we go through that filing cabinet's contents, wait a little bit longer, move to the next filing cabinet, go through its drawers, etc. So I hope that makes that logic much more clear. But I think we have finally finished up with everything here, unless we have some errors with the code, which is very possible. So I'm going to go ahead and try and compile. Thankfully we got no errors. So before we play test, what we should see happen, thanks to our logic here, is these nested for loops are going to run through all 3 of our arrays that we are storing inside of our multi-dimensional array. So we should see a zombie man, an imp, another zombie man, and then an imp, and then we should have a little bit of a longer delay. You can think of that long delay as like us moving from filing cabinet to filing cabinet. And then we should see a shotgunner, an imp, a pinky, an imp, and then a long delay. And then finally the very last wave, which would be an imp, shotgunner, pinky, hill knight. So here we go. We'll go ahead and test the map, play it, and hopefully everything will work. Alright, that was perfect. As you could see, when we entered the map, immediately monsters started spawning in. You could also tell that we were going through the waves because after every 4 monsters spawned, we had a noticeably longer delay, and then 4 more would show up, and then just like we wanted, we concluded with the Hell Knight in the 3rd wave. He was the very last monster that showed up. So that basically concludes this tutorial. We've covered what 2-dimensional arrays are, how to initialize the arrays like you see here, how to grab contents out of them, and I've also gone over the sort of confusing logic that comes with nested for loops to iterate all the way through a 2-dimensional array. And I really hope I didn't confuse you with that. I tried to explain it as best as I could, but I mean, it's a difficult topic to explain, but I do hope that I broke it down enough for you guys to understand. So thank you guys for watching. I also want to say, if you would like, you can extend this yourself and get some practice in. One thing that you can try to add in just for a little bit of practice is throw in a message after the player has killed all of the monsters, only after they've all spawned in, that basically congratulates him or tells him that he's finished all the waves. Another thing you can do for practice is show the number of each current wave at the top of the screen as the waves go on. So when you finish wave 1 and then wave 2 starts, show wave 2 at the top of the screen. So those are just some little practice exercises you can get in if you want to sort of test your skills and play around with these 2D arrays and get more familiar with them. But this has been a rather long tutorial, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. As always, thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, ask below. This is Chubbs, signing out.